He slammed the cockpit door shut and laughed. Captain Frank Dawson looked at his co-pilot and said, "Nobody's gonna know." He had been covering up the faulty carbon monoxide sensor for several flights in a row, filing false maintenance reports, forging inspection signatures, pocketing the repair budget. 222 people were buckled into seats behind him, and he didn't care, not even a little. He pushed the throttle forward, lifted Alaska Airlines Flight 391 into the sky above Seattle, and thought he had gotten away with it again. But the gas was already filling the cockpit, silently, invisibly. And somewhere in seat 14A, an 11-year-old girl named Emily Thompson was staring out the window, watching the clouds swallow the city below her, completely unaware that soon those two men up front would be dead weight, and she would be the only thing standing between 222 souls and the ground. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The morning started the way most mornings start, unremarkably. Emily Thompson woke up, pulled on her favorite hoodie, the faded navy blue one with the small embroidered wings on the left sleeve that her Uncle Brian had given her some birthdays ago, and dragged her roller bag to the front door of her grandmother's house in Seattle's Beacon Hill neighborhood. Her grandmother pressed a paper bag of onigiri into her hands and cupped Emily's face in her palms, the way she always did before long trips, studying her granddaughter's dark eyes like she was trying to memorize them. "You call me when you land," her grandmother said. "I always do, Grandma," Emily said. "I know. Call me anyway." Emily smiled, kissed her grandmother's cheek, and walked out into the cold October air. She didn't look back. If she had, she might have seen her grandmother standing at the window for a long time after the taxi pulled away, one hand pressed flat against the glass. SeaTac Airport was already buzzing when Emily arrived. Her escort, a woman from the airline's unaccompanied minor program named Dana Mitchell, walked her through security with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Dinah was pleasant enough in a distracted kind of way, checking her phone while Emily navigated the body scanner, collecting her backpack from the conveyor belt without being asked, slipping her shoes back on with quiet competence. "You've done this before," Dana said, noticing. "Lots of times," Emily said. "Big family in Boston?" "My dad, he works at MIT. Emily paused. "He studies fluid dynamics." Dana smiled politely. She didn't know what fluid dynamics was. She didn't ask. Gate B-17 was crowded. Emily found a seat near the window, pulled out her book, a worn paperback copy of Wolfgang Langewies's Stick and Rudder that her uncle had highlighted in 3 different colors, and started reading from a page she had dog-eared somewhere around chapter 6. The book was older than most of the adults in the terminal. Her uncle had found it in a used bookstore in Annapolis some years ago. He said it was the only flying book that ever told the truth. She was on her 2nd reading of it. Around her, the gate filled with the ordinary noise of ordinary people living ordinary lives. A businessman 2 seats down conducted a loud phone call about quarterly projections. A young mother across the aisle tried to coax apple slices into a toddler who wanted absolutely nothing to do with apple slices. 2 college students slept across 3 chairs each, backpacks as pillows, utterly unconcerned with the world. None of them looked at Emily. Nobody ever did. That was fine with her. Alaska Airlines Flight 391 began boarding. Emily gathered her things, showed her boarding pass to the gate agent. A tall man named Mike, who called her Little Miss and meant it kindly, and walked down the jetway alone. She found seat 14A, stowed her backpack in the overhead bin with both hands, because she had to stretch to reach it, and buckled herself in. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold oval of the window and watched the ground crew below moving in their fluorescent vests, loading bags, checking undercarriage panels, waving orange wands at each other. She watched the way they moved and thought, they think this is routine. She thought about her mother. Her mother's name had been Jessica Thompson, and she had been the most extraordinary pilot Emily had ever seen, which, given that Emily's uncle was a decorated Navy aviator, was saying something significant. Jessica had flown aerobatics. She had competed at the national level, threading her single-engine Extra 300 through maneuvers that made other pilots go quiet just watching. She had loved the sky the way some people love the ocean, not because it was safe, but because it demanded everything you had. She died when Emily was 7, a mechanical failure during a practice run above a field in Oregon. The investigation took months. The NTSB report was lengthy. Emily had read every word of it. That was when her uncle Brian stepped in. He didn't do it with speeches or grand gestures. He just started taking her up with him. First in a Cessna 172 that belonged to a flying club outside of Bremerton. Then in progressively more complex aircraft as she demonstrated, calmly and without fanfare, that she understood not just how to fly, but why planes flew. He taught her to feel the aircraft, to listen to it the way her mother had taught her to listen to music. Not just for the notes, but for what lived between them. By the time Emily was 9, she could perform a coordinated turn in instrument meteorological conditions. By 10, she had logged hours of flight time, all unofficial, all carefully recorded in a small green logbook that she kept in the front pocket of her backpack. She never told anyone at school. What would she say? The plane pushed back from the gate. The flight attendants performed their safety demonstration at the front of the cabin. Emily watched it without looking up from her book, listening to the specific language around emergency exits and oxygen masks and brace positions, the way a musician listens to a song they have played 100 times, not for the words, but to notice if anything had changed. Nothing had. In the cockpit, Captain Frank Dawson settled into his left seat and ran through his pre-flight checklist with the automated efficiency of a man who had been doing this for many years. He was heavy-set, with the kind of permanently tired face that suggested he had stopped being impressed by things sometime in the early 2000s. He had logged many flight hours. He knew this aircraft the way he knew his own kitchen. His first officer, a younger man named Alex Bennett, was running the radio checks and entering the flight plan parameters into the FMS. Alex was eager in the way that young pilots are eager, still finding wonder in the mechanics of flight, still slightly in love with the instrument panel. In front of him, neither man knew what was already happening to them. The carbon monoxide was odorless, colorless. It moved through the cockpit ventilation system the way water moves through cracks in rock. Quietly, persistently, following paths of least resistance. The sensor that would have detected it, a small device mounted near the left circuit breaker panel, had been showing a fault reading. The work order to replace it had been filed, then buried under a stack of competing maintenance priorities, then quietly removed from the active queue by Captain Dawson himself, who had flagged it as a non-critical system issue and signed off on the deferral without telling anyone. He had done it to save time. He had a vacation coming up. He didn't want the aircraft grounded. The effects became noticeable. Somewhere over the Idaho-Montana border, First Officer Bennett stopped mid-sentence during a routine exchange with Denver Center. He had been reporting their altitude and current heading. He got a few words out and then just stopped. The controller on the other end, a woman named Rachel Patel, who had been working the sector for some years, waited a beat. Alaska 391. Say again? Nothing. She tried again. Still nothing. Rachel flagged it to her supervisor immediately. It was the kind of silence that experienced controllers learn to treat as a fire alarm, not because it always meant something catastrophic, but because the one time you didn't treat it seriously would be the one time it was. Her supervisor, a stocky man named Carlos Mendoza, walked over and put on a spare headset. Alaska 391, Denver Center radio check. The frequency was dead. In the cockpit, Alex Bennett had slumped sideways in his seat. His left hand had dropped away from the throttle quadrant. His eyes were half open in a way that looked like sleep, but wasn't. Captain Dawson had lasted longer. The carbon monoxide affects people differently based on a dozen physiological variables, and Dawson was bigger, had more lung capacity, but the effect was the same. By the time he registered that something was catastrophically wrong, his hands were already too heavy to move. He managed to reach toward the radio transmitter. His fingers actually grazed the push-to-talk button, and then his arm fell. He did not lose consciousness immediately. He sat in his seat, aware that he was dying, aware that the aircraft was flying itself on autopilot toward a waypoint he had programmed earlier, aware that 222 people were behind him, and he had done this to them, all of it without meaning to. All of it because he had looked at a work order and decided it wasn't worth his time. The last coherent thought Captain Frank Dawson had before the darkness took him was not about the passengers. It was about his vacation. Outside, Alaska Flight 391 flew on. The autopilot held altitude and heading with mechanical indifference. The plane did not know that its crew was gone. It just flew. In the cabin, nobody noticed anything for a while. Then the intercom clicked twice. The kind of double click that happens when someone picks up a handset without speaking. A cabin crew signal. A check-in ping. The senior flight attendant, a woman named Karen Ellis, who had many years with the airline, looked at the intercom panel and frowned. She had been in the galley checking the snack cart. She picked up the handset and said, "Flight deck, this is the cabin. Do you copy?" Nothing. She tried again. "Captain Dawson, we are receiving your signal. Please respond." The silence on the line had a quality to it that Karen could not describe in words, but understood in her chest immediately. It wasn't dead air. It was wrong air. She told her colleague, a younger flight attendant named Tyler Brooks, to stay with the cart, and she walked briskly to the forward lavatory, knocked twice on the cockpit door, and then used her override code to unlock it. She opened the door. She stood there for a moment, looking at the two men slumped in their seats, at the instrument panel glowing green and white and orange in front of them, at the blue, endless sky beyond the windshield, and she processed, with very great difficulty, what she was looking at. Then she screamed. It wasn't a long scream. It lasted perhaps a moment, but it was the kind of scream that travels through a pressurized aluminum fuselage, like a knife through fabric. And every passenger within 6 rows heard it, and understood that something was not ordinary. Tyler came running. The other flight attendant, a woman named Nicole Garcia, came from the back. They crowded into the doorway together and looked at the pilots. "Call the company," Karen said. She was using the voice she used when she needed people to stop panicking and start doing things. Low, controlled, a voice designed to fill a room without raising an octave. "Tyler, call the company emergency line. Now." Tyler was already moving. Nicole said quietly, "Karen, who's flying the plane?" Karen looked at the autopilot panel. The green AP light was on. "It's on autopilot right now, but it's going to hit a waypoint in some time. And when it does, I don't know what it does next. Does anyone on board know how to fly?" Nobody said anything. The answer hung in the recycled cabin air like smoke. In seat 14A, Emily Thompson heard the scream. She had been reading her book, Chapter 9, the section on coordination, the part where Langevici talked about how pilots confuse skidding turns with real turns and never understand why their aircraft feel wrong. She had read this chapter several times. She was reading it again because her uncle had said once that you didn't really understand a concept until you could explain it to someone else in plain language. She heard the scream and looked up. She watched the two flight attendants rush forward. She watched Tyler pick up the intercom handset. She watched the whispered conversation happening at the front of the cabin that people were pretending not to watch. She watched Karen go through the cockpit door and come back out and stand in the aisle with her hand over her mouth. Emily unclipped her seatbelt. She wasn't afraid. That was the thing that she would try to explain later, could never quite find the right words for. She wasn't afraid. She was alert. There was a difference. Fear was a weather system that moved in and clouded everything. What Emily felt was clarity, sharp, almost painful clarity, like the feeling you get when you step from a dark room into bright sunlight and everything snaps into focus. She walked to the front of the cabin. She was small for her age, and in the aisle she had to navigate around an armrest that a businessman had left deployed, and around a tray table that someone had pulled down and then abandoned. She moved carefully, efficiently, without hurrying. Tyler saw her first. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat." He caught himself mid-sentence. She was 11. "Miss, please go back to your seat. We have a situation, and it's not safe." "I heard the scream," Emily said. "What happened to the pilots? Are they incapacitated?" Something in the way she said the word, not the way a child says an unfamiliar word trying it out, but the way a professional says a clinical term, precisely and without drama, made Tyler stop. Karen came out of the cockpit and nearly collided with Emily. "You need to go sit down, sweetheart." "Is the autopilot on?" Emily asked. Karen stared at her. "What?" "The autopilot, is it still engaged? Because if it is, I need to know how far we are from the next programmed waypoint and what the FMS is going to do when we get there." Karen's mouth opened, closed. She looked at Tyler. Tyler looked at Nicole. Nicole looked at Emily. "I know how to fly," Emily said. It was not a boast. It was not a plea. It was just information delivered in the same even tone she used when she told her uncle she had completed a pre-flight inspection. "Not a plane this size, but I know how planes work. I can hold altitude. I can communicate with the tower, but I need someone to tell me right now, what is the status of the autopilot?" "How old are you?" Tyler said. 11. Nobody said anything for what felt like a long moment. Then Karen said, "The AP light is on. I don't know what happens next. The FMS says something about a waypoint D-E-N. She spelled it out like she was reading from a foreign language. I don't know what that means." "Denver," Emily said. "That's Denver. That means the autopilot is routing us to Denver." She exhaled, one long, controlled breath, the way her uncle had taught her to exhale before she touched the yoke. "Okay," she said. "That's okay. That's actually good. I need to get in the cockpit." "You cannot." Tyler started. "Tyler." Karen's voice was quiet and absolute. "Let her in." Tyler stepped back. Emily walked through the cockpit door. The first thing she registered was the smell, something chemical, faintly sweet, the residue of carbon monoxide she couldn't actually detect, but whose effects she could see in the way both men were sitting, the way their bodies had surrendered to gravity. She had read about this. She knew immediately what had happened. She moved to the first officer's seat, the right seat, and looked at the instrument panel with the concentrated stillness of someone who had spent years studying it in books and simulators and small aircraft with her uncle and was now seeing the real thing for the first time at altitude and was not going to allow herself to be overwhelmed by the gap between the two. The altimeter read high altitude. The airspeed indicator showed high speed. The autopilot was on. The horizon was steady. The engines were humming. She assessed. She did not touch anything yet. Then she picked up the radio handset and pressed the push-to-talk button. "Denver Center," she said. "This is Alaska Airlines Flight 391. I need immediate assistance. Both pilots are incapacitated. My name is Emily Thompson. I am 11 years old. I'm in the cockpit and I know how to fly a small aircraft. I need someone to talk me through what I need to do. Please respond." She released the button and waited. The frequency crackled. Rachel Patel, in her headset in Denver, heard the transmission and felt every muscle in her body go completely still. There was a moment, a single suspended moment, where the entire Denver Center sector went quiet. Controllers at adjacent stations looked up. Supervisors turned from their screens. Someone dropped a coffee cup, and nobody bent to pick it up. Then Carlos Mendoza stepped to a supervisor's station, picked up the emergency phone and said, in a voice remarkably similar to Emily's, even and clear and without a single wasted word, "We have an emergency. All hands." Rachel pressed her push-to-talk and said, "Alaska 391, Denver Center copies your transmission. Can you confirm, say again, both pilots are incapacitated?" "Confirmed," Emily said. "I believe it's carbon monoxide poisoning. I can see the sensor fault light on the environmental panel. Both crew members are unconscious and unresponsive. Autopilot is engaged. Routing to DEN. I have basic stick and rudder training in general aviation, Cessna and Piper, about some hours. I have never flown anything this size." Another beat of silence. Then Rachel said, "Copy all, Alaska 391. You are doing great. Do not touch the autopilot. Do not touch anything yet. I'm getting someone on the line who is gonna help you. Just keep talking to me." "Understood," Emily said. In the back of the aircraft, word was beginning to spread in the way that words spread in enclosed spaces, quietly, then all at once. A man in a seat heard something from the woman next to him who had overheard the flight attendant's hushed conversation in the aisle. A woman in another seat was already on her phone trying to reach her husband before the flight attendant reached her row and gently asked everyone to remain calm. Remain calm. 222 people in a metal tube at high altitude being asked to remain calm. In the front galley, Karen Ellis pressed her forehead against the cool metal of the overhead bin and said a prayer she hadn't said since she was young. And in the cockpit, an 11-year-old girl with a worn paperback flying manual in her backpack and hours of flight time in her logbook sat in the right seat of a Boeing 757 and held the radio handset in both hands and waited for someone to tell her what to do next. She was not afraid. She was the most awake she had ever been in her life. The autopilot hummed. The engines held their steady roar. Outside the windshield, high above the mountains, the sky was absolutely cloudless and impossibly blue. The kind of sky her mother had loved most. Emily looked at it and thought, "Mom, I've got this." The radio crackled. "Alaska 391, said a new voice, older, male, deliberate, and steady. "This is Captain Paul Whitaker, retired United Airlines. I'm a volunteer at the FAA Emergency Coordination Center. I've got many hours on the 757. I'm not going anywhere. Neither are you. Let's talk." Emily closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them, pressed the button, and said, "I'm listening." Captain Paul Whitaker had been sitting in the FAA Emergency Coordination Center doing absolutely nothing when the call came in. He was there as a volunteer, retired some time ago after a career that spanned many years in several aircraft types, the last several of which had been exclusively on the Boeing 757 and 767. He volunteered a couple days a week because his wife said he needed something to do with his hands other than reorganize the garage. And because, truthfully, he still missed the radio. He missed the sound of pilots talking. He missed being part of it. He had never expected to need to be part of something like this. Carlos Mendoza had pulled him to the emergency line quickly from the moment Rachel's transmission came through. There was no briefing. There was no time for one. Carlos just said, 757, both pilots down, 11-year-old girl in the right seat. General aviation background, some hours. And Paul Whitaker had picked up the handset and stopped being a retired man reorganizing his garage and started being the only thing standing between a child and a catastrophe. Alaska 391, he said. This is Captain Paul Whitaker, retired United Airlines. I'm not going anywhere. Neither are you. Let's talk. The response came back clean and steady. No tremor, no catch in the breath. Just a girl's voice clear as a tuning fork saying, I'm listening. Paul exhaled once. He thought, okay, this one's got something. First thing I need you to do, he said, is tell me everything you see on the primary flight display directly in front of you. Don't interpret it. Just read it to me like you're reading a grocery list. A beat. Then, altitude is high. Airspeed high knots indicated. Vertical speed is 0. Heading is whatever. Autopilot engaged. I can see the green AP light. The FMS shows our next waypoint as DEN with an ETA sometime. Paul had the aircraft performance charts open on the laptop in front of him. He was already calculating. Good. Good girl. Now look at the fuel quantity indicators. They should be on the lower center portion of the panel. I see them. Left main shows certain percent. Right main shows certain percent. That's enough, he said. We're okay on fuel. Now listen to me carefully. Do not touch the autopilot. Do not touch the yoke. Do not touch anything right now. The aircraft is flying itself, and that is exactly what we want it to do. Your only job right now is to be my eyes. Can you do that? Yes, Emily said. Some time had passed since she first keyed the radio. In the cabin behind her, Karen Ellis was moving through the rows, with the practiced calm of someone who had been trained to manage human panic the same way a dam manages floodwater, not by stopping it, but by channeling it. She spoke to each row in turn. Her voice was level. Her face was controlled. She had been a flight attendant for many years, and she had handled drunk passengers and medical emergencies in a bird strike over somewhere that had taken out an engine and left people certain they were going to die. She had held a man's hand while he had a stroke at high altitude. She had talked a college student out of opening an emergency exit door mid-flight because he was having a panic attack and thought the door was a bathroom. She had never had to tell 222 people that an 11-year-old was flying the plane. She was not going to tell them. Not yet. Not unless she had to. We are experiencing a technical difficulty with the flight crew, she said to each row one by one, making eye contact, keeping her posture open and calm. The aircraft is on autopilot, and we are in contact with ground control. We need everyone to remain in their seats with seatbelts fastened. We will update you as we have information. A man in a seat mid-50s business class upgrade, the kind of man who had an opinion about everything, grabbed her arm as she passed. What kind of technical difficulty? What does that mean? Are the pilots okay? Karen looked at him directly. Sir, I need you to let go of my arm and stay in your seat." Something in her eyes made him let go. Tyler was in the back doing the same thing. He was young and had been flying for some years, and he was terrified in a way that felt like cold water filling his chest. But he had watched Karen's face when she made the decision to let that girl into the cockpit. And he had decided that if Karen believed in something, he was going to believe in it too. That was the deal. That was how you got through it. He moved through the rows. He smiled. He kept his voice low. He kept his hands visible, open, unthreatening. Somewhere around a row, a woman grabbed his sleeve and said, very quietly, so her daughter sitting next to her couldn't hear, "The man across the aisle says the pilot's passed out. Is that true?" Tyler crouched down to her level. "Ma'am, we have everything under control." "Is that true?" He held her gaze. "We have the best people working on this right now. I promise you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded and let go of his sleeve and put her arm around her daughter and stared straight ahead. Tyler stood up and kept walking. In the cockpit, Paul Whitaker was working through the checklist in his head. Not the emergency checklist, not yet. Because the emergency right now wasn't the aircraft, it was the pilot. He needed to know what this girl could actually do before he put her in a situation where she had to do it. "Emily," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. No brave answers, just the truth. What have you actually flown?" She answered without hesitation. "Cessna 172 some hours. Piper Cherokee some hours. One flight in a Cirrus SR-22. My uncle let me hold the controls for some time in cruise. I've done pattern work, crosswind landings, basic instrument work under the hood. I've never flown anything with more than one engine, and I've never flown anything with jet engines. Have you ever flown on autopilot?" The Cirrus had an autopilot. My uncle showed me how to disengage it. Do you know what happens to the aircraft when you disengage autopilot on a jet at cruise altitude with no input on the controls? A pause, shorter than he expected. "It depends on the trim state. If the aircraft is properly trimmed, it should maintain its current attitude for a period of time. If it's not trimmed, it could pitch or roll." Paul Whitaker put the phone down for a moment and looked at Carlos Mendoza. Carlos Mendoza raised his eyebrows. Paul picked the phone back up. "Emily, who taught you that?" "My uncle and Wolfgang Langewiesche." "You've read Stick and Rudder?" "Twice. I'm on my third." He almost laughed. He caught it. This was not the moment. "Okay," he said. "Here's what's going to happen. We are not going to disengage the autopilot for a long time. The autopilot is your friend. The autopilot is the most experienced pilot on that aircraft right now, and we are going to let it do its job. What I need you to do is make sure you know where the autopilot disconnect button is, because if something happens, if the autopilot drops out on its own, you need to be ready to fly manually. Can you find the red button on the top of the yoke?" A sound of movement. "Found it. Do not press it. Just know where it is." "Understood." Some time since first contact. At that moment at Denver International Airport, the machinery of emergency response was already in motion. The airport emergency coordinator had been notified. Fire trucks and ambulances were being repositioned toward a runway. The FAA duty officer in Washington had been briefed. The NTSB had a duty officer standing by. An Alaska Airlines vice president of operations was on a conference call with others trying to figure out what their legal exposure was going to be. And someone on that call was already saying the words media strategy in a tone of voice that made the person next to him feel sick. None of that mattered to Emily. What mattered to Emily at that exact moment was the sound that had just come from the panel in front of her. A soft two-tone chime followed by an amber light on the FMS display that she did not recognize. "Captain Whitaker," she said, keeping her voice even. "I have an amber caution light on the FMS I haven't seen before. It says VNAVVALT. In Denver Center." Paul went very still. "Where exactly is the light? Top of the display or bottom?" "Bottom right." He knew what it was. The aircraft was approaching its programmed cruise altitude constraint for the Denver arrival sequence. The autopilot was preparing to begin descent. If Emily didn't do anything, it would begin descending on its own. But the descent profile was programmed for a crew that was monitoring it, making active adjustments, communicating with ATC. A fully automated descent into Denver airspace without an active pilot managing the energy state was not something he wanted. "Emily, listen carefully. The autopilot is about to start descending. That's normal. But I need you to do something for me. On the mode control panel, the horizontal panel with the knobs and buttons above the primary flight display, I need you to find the button that says Alt." A pause, longer this time. "I see buttons that say heading, speed, Alt, vertical speed, LNAV, VNAV. Perfect. Press Alt." "Press it now?" "Press it now." A sound, a click. Then the VNAV light went off. A white Alt light came on. "Good. You just took the aircraft out of the automated descent profile and put it in altitude hold. The plane will now hold altitude until we tell it otherwise. You just did your first real intervention on a jet aircraft, Emily. How do you feel?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Like I need to do the next thing." Paul Whitaker thought, yeah, that's a pilot. In the back of the cabin, the man who had been grabbing flight attendants had started doing something more dangerous. He had started talking. He was the kind of man whose voice carried without him trying. And he had decided, based on absolutely nothing except his own adrenaline and the look on Karen's face when she had said technical difficulty, that he understood what was happening, and that other people deserved to understand it too. "The pilots are out," he said to the man next to him who had been trying to sleep. That's what she meant. Technical difficulty. There's nobody flying this thing. The man sat up very fast. "What?" I heard the flight attendant on the intercom before she realized the volume was up. She said, I'm telling you exactly what she said. She said, "Both crew members are down." Those were her words. Down. The man looked at the man next to him. The man next to him looked at the row in front of him. The row in front of him contained a woman who had been listening to every word with growing horror, and who turned around and said, "Did you just say the pilots are unconscious?" Karen heard it from rows away. The quality of the sound in the cabin changed, not louder, but denser, a thickening of attention, the way a crowd goes quiet right before something breaks. She moved. "Excuse me," she said, getting in front of the man, positioning her body between him and the rows behind him, her voice dropping to something that was very quiet and very clear, and did not have a single millimeter of give in it. "Sir, I need you to stop talking right now. People have a right to—" "Sir." Her eyes did not move from his. "I have 222 people on this aircraft. If you cause a panic in this cabin right now, people will get hurt. Real people. The woman with a little girl. The elderly man who needs his medication. Real people who are depending on everyone staying in their seats and staying calm. You can be angry at me when we land. You can sue the airline. You can write a letter to Congress. But right now, you are going to sit down and stop talking. Do you understand me?" The man opened his mouth, closed it. Something moved across his face. Not shame exactly, but a recognition of something larger than himself. He sat down. Karen walked to the front of the cabin and picked up the PA handset. She had not planned to do this. She had planned to keep it contained, quiet, controlled. But the man had made that decision for her, and now she had a choice. Let the rumor fill the space, or fill it herself with something better. She pressed the button. Her voice came through every speaker on the aircraft, calm and direct, and completely without apology. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to be honest with you. Our flight crew has been incapacitated due to a medical situation. The aircraft is currently on autopilot and is being guided by air traffic control. We have a trained individual in the cockpit working directly with aviation experts on the ground. We are some time from Denver International Airport, where emergency crews are standing by. I need everyone to remain seated with seatbelts fastened, tray tables up and seat backs in the upright position. Follow the instructions of the cabin crew. We are doing everything in our power to bring this aircraft down safely. She set the handset down. For a moment, the cabin was absolutely silent. Then it erupted. Not into screaming, into something messier and more human than screaming. People grabbed each other. Phones came out. A man began to cry, not quietly, but with the full, unashamed force of a man who had been holding it in since the moment he heard the first scream some time ago. A woman in first class took the hand of the stranger sitting next to her, a man she had exchanged a few words with since boarding, and held it so hard that her knuckles went white. Somewhere in the back, a child asked her mother, "Is the plane going to crash?" And the mother said, in a voice that was the bravest thing she had ever said in her life, "No, baby, we're going to be fine." She didn't know if it was true. She said it anyway, because that was what you did. In the cockpit, Emily heard the muffled surge of noise through the door and felt it in her sternum. Not fear, but weight. She understood, in a way that was beyond her years and also entirely consistent with who she was, that the sound she was hearing was the sound of 220, two people confronting their own mortality. She understood that their fear had a shape and a texture, and that it was pressing against the cockpit door right now, like water against a hull. She turned back to the instruments. "Captain Whitaker," she said. "They just announced it to the cabin. It's going to get louder back there." "Eyes forward," he said. "You can't help them. The only way you help them is by doing exactly what we're doing right now. Okay? Okay. Let's talk about the descent. When we're ready to come down, and we're not ready yet. But when we are, I'm going to walk you through every single step. The aircraft is going to do most of the work, but I need you to understand what's going to happen before it happens. No surprises. You with me? With you? Good. Here's what a descent into Denver is going to look like." He talked for some time. He talked about rate of descent and airspeed management, and when to expect the flaps, and what the flap extension would feel like, and what the gear extension would sound like. A rumble, a thunk, a change in the aerodynamics of the aircraft that would feel like hitting a wall of air. And he talked about the runway, the length of it, the width of it, the way the approach lights would look from altitude, and the way the ground would look different than she expected because Denver was high above sea level, and the visual cues were compressed. He talked about the auto-land system on the 757, and why they might be able to use it, and what the conditions were for it, and what she would need to do if it didn't work. He talked and she listened, and neither of them wasted a word. At Denver Center, Rachel Patel had cleared a corridor of airspace wide on the approach to a runway. She had rerouted other aircraft. She was tracking Flight 391 on her scope, watching the altitude hold, watching the ground speed and the drift and the fuel burn, doing the math constantly, running the numbers the way she always ran numbers, automatically. The calculations happening in the back of her mind while the front of her mind did everything else. She had a daughter, young. She was thinking about her daughter. Her supervisor, Carlos Mendoza, appeared at her shoulder. "How's she doing?" "She's solid," Rachel said. "Steadier than half the actual pilots I've worked." Carlos nodded. He didn't say anything else. There was nothing else to say. And then something happened that nobody had planned for. The cockpit door opened. Karen pushed it open with her shoulder, carrying 2 oxygen masks, portable units from the first aid kit, the kind designed for passenger medical emergencies. She had decided on her own, without asking anyone, that if the carbon monoxide was still present in the cockpit, Emily needed protection. She had grabbed the masks and she had come forward, and she had opened the door. "Don't," Emily started. "I'm not staying," Karen said. She moved quickly, efficiently, fitting one of the masks over Emily's face before the girl could object. The mask was too big. It was designed for an adult face, and it sat loose on Emily's smaller features. But Karen pressed it against her cheeks and said, "Hold it there. Hold it with your hand. Breathe through it." Then she moved to the pilots, checking their pulses the way she had been trained to check pulses, fast and practiced. Captain Dawson's pulse was present, but weak. Alex Bennett's was stronger. "They're both Alaska," Karen said. Emily exhaled. The mask fogged. "Okay," she said. "Okay, can you get them onto oxygen too? There are crash oxygen masks somewhere in the—" "I know," Karen said. She was already moving. She found the cockpit oxygen outlets behind the pilot seats and connected both men to the system, fitting the masks to their unconscious faces with hands that shook only slightly. "How are you doing?" Karen asked. She was looking at Emily the way a person looks at something they are trying to memorize. Emily looked at the altimeter, looked at the airspeed, looked at the horizon. "Ask me again when we land," she said. Karen almost smiled. She almost said something about the girl's mother. She almost said something about courage or fate or the particular way that some people seem born for the worst moments. She swallowed all of it and said, "I'll be right outside the door." She left the cockpit and pulled the door half closed behind her. The radio crackled. Paul Whitaker said, "Emily, you still with me?" "Still here. Rachel's going to start talking to you about the descent soon. Before she does, I want to tell you something." He paused. The pause was deliberate, the kind of pause that a man makes when he is about to say something true. "I've been doing this for many years. I've worked with pilots who had thousands of hours, who cracked under less pressure than what you're carrying right now. What you are doing, the way you are doing it. There are grown men and women in the FAA right now watching this unfold on their screens who cannot believe what they are seeing. And I want you to know that before things get harder, because they are going to get harder soon. And I need you to remember this feeling right now, the calm you have right now. Hold on to it." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Captain Whitaker, are you scared?" He thought about lying. "A little," he said. "Yeah." "Me too," she said, "but I'm not going to let it drive." Paul Whitaker set down his coffee cup, which had been sitting untouched for some time, and pressed his fingers flat against the desk, and said, very quietly, so the microphone didn't pick it up, "Lord have mercy." Then he pressed push to talk and said, "Okay, let's go over the descent checklist one more time. High altitude, some time to Denver. 222 people behind a door breathing recycled air and holding each other's hands and checking their phones for messages they might never get to send. And in the right seat, An 11-year-old girl with a paper oxygen mask pressed to her face, and hours in her logbook, holding the fate of all of them in hands that were steady and small and absolutely certain. The altimeter read high altitude, for now. Sometime into the descent briefing, Emily's hands started to shake. Not much, not enough that anyone watching would have noticed. Just a faint tremor in her right fingers. The ones wrapped around the edge of the center console. The ones that had been gripping the same surface for some time without her realizing it. She noticed it the way you notice a crack in a wall. Not because it appeared suddenly, but because you finally looked directly at the thing you had been avoiding looking at. She pressed her hand flat against her thigh. The tremor stopped. She did not mention it to Captain Whitaker. What she did say was, "You said the flap extension is going to feel like hitting a wall of air. Can you tell me exactly how much the nose is going to pitch when that happens? Because if I'm not expecting it, I might overcorrect." On the other end of the line, Paul Whitaker stopped what he was doing and made a sound that was not quite a laugh. More like the exhalation of a man who has just been reminded why he loved aviation in the first place. Flaps 5, you'll feel a slight pitch up. The nose wants to rise, maybe some degrees. You don't touch anything. The autopilot will compensate. Flaps 15, same thing but slightly more pronounced. Flaps 30, that's when you'll really feel it. The aircraft is going to slow down and the nose is going to want to drop. Again, do not touch anything. Trust the system. And if the autopilot drops out during flap extension, then you're hand flying a 757 on final approach. Silence. "Which we are going to practice for right now," he said. "In your mind, walk me through what you would do." She walked him through it. She was word perfect. Flight 391 was sometime from Denver. At Denver International, the airport had quietly shifted into a state that looked, from the outside, like an ordinary morning. Because the last thing airport management wanted was people in the terminal watching emergency vehicles stage on the tarmac and pulling out their phones to live stream it. But underneath the ordinary surface, everything was moving. The runway had been cleared. The fire suppression trucks were in position. Paramedics had been briefed on carbon monoxide poisoning and on the likelihood of multiple casualties upon landing. The airport director, a woman named Carol Huang, had been on the phone with Alaska Airlines Operations Center for some time, and the conversation had not been pleasant. "What do you mean you knew about the sensor?" Carol said. The voice on the other end was careful, lawyer careful. "We're still investigating the maintenance record discrepancy. Was the sensor fault reported or not?" A pause. "We're looking into that." Carol Huang set the phone face down on her desk and pressed both palms flat on the surface and breathed exactly the way her cardiologist had told her to breathe when her blood pressure spiked. And then she picked the phone back up and said, "I want every piece of documentation on that aircraft's last several maintenance checks on my desk before that plane touches the ground. Are we clear?" The voice on the other end said they were clear. They were not going to be clear. In the cockpit, Rachel Patel's voice came through the radio with the specific cadence of a controller who was managing everything she had and giving none of it away. "Alaska 391, Denver Center. I'm going to bring you down to lower altitude. I need you to select the altitude selector on the mode control panel and dial it to that. Then press Alt-Cell." Emily found the selector. She'd been staring at it for some time, memorizing its position the way she memorized chord fingerings on the guitar her grandmother had given her. By feel, by repetition, by refusing to rely on having to look. She dialed. She pressed. The nose of the aircraft tilted forward, gently, barely perceptibly, but she felt it. The autopilot had captured the new altitude target and begun the descent. "Vertical speed is showing down," Emily reported. "Perfect," Rachel said. That's exactly what we want." And then, without warning, the aircraft shuddered. It was not violent. It was brief, a single pulse, like a hiccup in the airframe, lasting no more than a moment. But at high altitude in a jet aircraft with no active pilot crew, a moment of unexplained vibration is an eternity. Emily's hands went to the yoke without thinking. She caught herself, did not grip it, pulled her hands back. "Captain Whitaker," she said, voice absolutely flat. "I just felt a vibration. Duration brief. No change in instruments that I can see. No warning lights." Paul was already talking to an Alaska Airlines technical rep who had been patched into the line recently. His name was Phil Garrett, and he had many years of 757 systems experience and the kind of dry, relentless confidence that made him exactly the person you wanted in a room when something was going wrong with a large aircraft. "Phil," Paul said, off Emily's frequency for a moment, "did you catch that?" "Caught it," Phil said. "Could be wake turbulence from the traffic we rerouted earlier. Could be nothing. Tell her to watch the engine instruments, N1, N2, EGT. If those are stable, we're fine." Paul switched back. "Emily, look at the engine instruments. There should be 2 sets, one for each engine. Tell me what you see." She looked. She read. "Both engines nominal. N1 stable at certain, EGT within limits." "We're fine," Paul said. "That was turbulence. You handled it exactly right. You went for the yoke and you stopped yourself. That's the right instinct and the right restraint, both at the same time." "That's hard to teach," Emily said. "It won't happen again." "The turbulence? Me reaching for the yoke without being told." He thought, "She's going to be one hell of a pilot someday," he said. "Keep your eyes on those engine gauges. Tell me the moment anything changes." Sometime to Denver. In the cabin, Tyler Brooks was doing something he had not been trained to do and had no manual for. He was being a priest, not literally, but the elderly man Karen had mentioned had stopped responding to simple questions and was clutching his chest. And the woman next to him was saying, "He has a heart condition," in a voice that kept cracking. And Tyler had knelt in the aisle next to the seat and taken the man's wrist and found the pulse. Present, irregular, but present, and said, Sir, can you hear me? I need you to breathe with me. In through your nose, hold, out through your mouth." The man's name was Gerald Hutchins. He was elderly. He had been flying to Denver to see his granddaughter graduate from nursing school. He had a nitroglycerin tablet in his shirt pocket, which his wife, at home in Seattle, had reminded him about several times before he left the house. "Do you have your nitro?" Tyler asked. Gerald managed to nod. "Can you get it out?" Gerald's hand shook. Tyler helped him, got the tablet under his tongue, kept his hand on the man's wrist, counted the beats, kept his own face calm. The woman next to Gerald, a stranger, a woman named Patricia who had been flying to Denver for a conference on educational policy and would never attend another conference without thinking about this moment, said, "Is he going to be okay?" "He's going to be okay," Tyler said. And then, because he needed it to be true, and because saying things out loud sometimes made them more true, he said it again. "He is going to be okay." Gerald Hutchins opened his eyes. They were pale blue, watery, and extremely frightened. He looked at Tyler's face and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Son, who's flying this plane?" Tyler held the man's gaze. He smiled the way Karen had smiled at him when he was new and terrified, and she had said simply, "The job is simple. You take care of people." "The best person for the job," Tyler said. Gerald closed his eyes again. His pulse steadied. sometime to Denver. At that moment, in the FAA Emergency Coordination Center, a man walked in who had not been invited and hadn't been called. His name was Lieutenant Commander Brian Thompson, United States Navy, retired. He was lean and quiet, with the kind of posture that persists in former military personnel long after the uniform comes off. He had driven from his home in Colorado Springs quickly after the Alaska Airlines Operations Center had, as part of their emergency notification protocol, called the emergency contact listed for their unaccompanied minor in seat 14A. The emergency contact was him. He had listened to the message from the airline representative. He had sat in his kitchen for a moment. Then he had picked up his car keys and driven. Carlos Mendoza came through the door and started to say something. Brian held up one hand, not aggressive, just definitive, and said, "I'm Emily's uncle. I'm a naval aviator. Some hours fixed wing, some rotary. I taught her everything she knows. Tell me what she doesn't know, and I will fill it in." Carlos looked at him for a moment. Then he pointed at the chair next to Paul Whitaker. Brian sat down. Paul put a second headset in front of him. Brian put it on, and for a moment he just listened to his niece's voice reading instrument data to Rachel Patel with the steady clip precision he had spent years teaching her. And something moved across his face that Paul Whitaker, who was watching, could not fully identify. It was grief and pride and terror and love, compressed into a single expression that lasted a moment and then was gone, replaced by the face of a man who had things to do. "What does she not know?" Paul asked quietly. "She's never flared a jet," Brian said. "In a small plane, the flare is intuitive. In a 757, if she pulls back the same way she does in a Cessna, she'll balloon the aircraft, and we'll have a hard landing at best. I was going to talk her through it. I'll talk her through it," Brian said. "She knows my voice. When it gets close, she needs to hear my voice." Paul looked at him. "You sure?" "She's my kid," Brian said. It was the only answer he had, and it was the only answer necessary. Paul nodded and stepped back from the primary frequency. "Sometime to Denver." Rachel's voice came through, clear and measured. "Alaska 391. Descend and maintain lower altitude. Speed certain knots. You're going to need to select speed on the MCP and dial it back." Emily found the speed selector. She dialed. The throttles on the aircraft, controlled automatically, not by hand, began to pull back. She heard the engine note change. She felt the airspeed begin to bleed off. "Certain indicated and coming back," she reported. "Good. Emily, I'm going to give you a heading change. Turn left to certain. Find the heading selector on the MCP and dial it to that. Then press HDGSEL." She found it. Dialed. Pressed. The aircraft began a shallow left bank, smooth and gradual. The autopilot rolling them onto the new heading with the effortless authority of a system that did not know what fear was. "Heading certain," Emily said. "Perfect. Emily, in some time I'm going to turn you onto final approach. When I do, we're going to configure the aircraft for landing. Flaps, gear, the whole picture. Captain Whitaker and your uncle are going to walk you through every step." Emily went very still. "My uncle?" Brian pressed push to talk. "Hey, kid." The silence that followed lasted a moment. On the frequency, nobody breathed. Then Emily said, "Uncle Brian." Not a question, not relief, just his name, said in the voice of someone who had been holding something very heavy and had just, for the first time, felt someone else put a hand on the other side of it. "I'm here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." "How did you—" "Doesn't matter. We've got some time and I need to talk to you about the flare. You listening? Listening?" "Landing a jet is different from the Cherokee," he said. He did not say different from anything you've ever done, because that would put the weight of the unknown on her. and he was not going to do that. The flare happens later than you think. The ground is going to look like it's coming up faster than you expect. Because Denver sits high, and the visual cues compress. When I tell you to flare, I need you to be gentle. We're talking about back pressure that feels like you're barely doing anything at all. You understand? Like holding a bird, she said. It was something he had said to her years ago about control inputs on a sensitive aircraft. Hold the controls like you're holding a bird, firm enough that it can't escape, gentle enough that you don't crush it. Exactly like that, he said. His voice didn't crack. He made sure of it. Sometime to Denver. In the cabin, Karen had stopped walking the aisles. She was standing at the forward galley, phone pressed to her ear on the airline's crew communication line. The voice on the other end was her supervisor at Alaska Airlines, a man named Tom Briggs, who had been in operations for many years. "How's she doing?" Tom asked. "She's incredible," Karen said. "Tom, I have been on this airplane for many years, and I have never—" She stopped, started again. She sat down in that seat, and she just became whatever the plane needed her to be. I don't have another way to describe it. Tom was quiet for a moment. "Karen, when this is over, whatever she needs from this airline, you tell her she'll get it. Tell her yourself." She set the phone down and walked back to the cockpit door and pushed it open slightly and looked at the back of Emily's head. The dark hair in its practical ponytail, the oxygen mask still pressed to her face, the slight but straight set of her shoulders, and said nothing, just looked. Then she closed the door and stood with her back against it, facing the cabin. Sometime to Denver. Lower altitude. Alaska 391, turn right heading certain. Intercept the ILS for runway certain right. You are some distance from the outer marker. Emily dialed the heading. The aircraft banked right. "Gear down," Rachel said. Emily looked for the gear handle. She knew where it was. She had asked about it earlier, and Paul had described its position precisely. A large lever on the center console with a wheel-shaped knob at the end. She found it, pulled it down. The sound hit her before the feeling did. A deep mechanical rumble from beneath the aircraft, a sequence of thumps that traveled up through the seat and into her spine. And then a series of 3 green lights appeared on the gear indicator panel. 3 green, she said. Gear down and locked. "Good," Paul said. "Flaps 5. She found the flap lever, extended to 5 degrees. The aircraft buffeted briefly, gently, exactly as described. The nose pitched up a fraction. She kept her hands off the yoke. "Flaps 15. She extended. More buffet, more pitch. She watched the airspeed bleed back through certain. The altimeter was unwinding fast now. Lower altitude. "Emily," Brian's voice, steady as a metronome. "How do you feel?" "Tell me when to flare," she said. "Not yet. Flaps 31st, and then I need you to do something we haven't talked about." She said, "Tell me. In some time, I need you to disengage the autopilot and fly this aircraft manually to the runway." The cabin of the aircraft at that moment was the quietest it had been since takeoff, not silent. You cannot have 222 people in a pressurized tube and have silence, but quiet in the way that churches are quiet or hospitals. The kind of quiet that happens when human beings collectively hold their breath. Because they understand at some cellular level that something is being decided. The man who had been crying had stopped crying. He was gripping his armrest with both hands and staring at the seatback in front of him. And his lips were moving very slightly. And he was probably praying and probably saying the same word over and over. The woman who had taken the stranger's hand in first class had not let go. The stranger had not pulled away. Patricia, the conference attendee who had helped Gerald Hutchins find his nitroglycerin tablet, had her eyes closed. She was thinking about her daughter, who was young, and about the argument they'd had the morning she left about something so small she could no longer remember what it was. And she was composing in her head the exact words she was going to say to her daughter the moment she got off this plane. She was already certain she was going to get off this plane. She did not know why she was certain. She just was. In 14A's original seat, the window seat where Emily had sat with her book that morning, the worn paperback copy of Stick and Rudder sat tucked in the seat back pocket where she had left it. It had slid halfway out and was leaning against the tray table latch, its dog-eared pages fanning slightly in the recycled air. Nobody noticed it. In the cockpit, Emily said, "Uncle Brian, if I disengage the autopilot and I do something wrong, you won't. But if I do, Emily," his voice dropped to something private, something that existed only between them. The register he used when they were in a cockpit together. And he was telling her something important that had nothing to do with the checklist. Your mother flew into headwinds that would have broken anyone else. She didn't because she knew the difference between the airplane telling you it's afraid and the airplane telling you something is actually wrong. You know that difference. You have always known it. Now disengage the autopilot and fly this aircraft. She reached up, found the red button on the yoke, pressed it. The autopilot disconnect alarm sounded, 2 sharp tones, and then the aircraft was hers. Completely, entirely, irrevocably hers. She felt it immediately, the live weight of it through the yoke, the way the aircraft breathed and moved and pushed back against her inputs. Nothing like the simulator, nothing like the Cessna. Enormous and alive and absolutely indifferent to the fact that she was 11 years old. "I have the aircraft," she said. "Flaps 30, Brian said. She extended. She felt the wall of air Paul had described. The drag biting in, the nose dropping, the airspeed crashing back through certain. She had back pressure already on the yoke, instinctive and exactly right. "You're at certain altitude," Rachel said. "Runway in sight. You're on the center line. You are doing perfect." She was not doing perfect. Her inputs were slightly uneven. A touch left of center. A small overcorrection to the right. The aircraft skidding faintly in the crosswind that was pushing across the runway at some knots. She felt it. She corrected. The aircraft came back to center line. "Lower altitude," Rachel said. "Emily," Brian's voice, quiet like he was sitting in the right seat next to her, the way he had many times. "When I say now, you give me the gentlest back pressure you have ever put on a control, like you're holding a bird. Lower altitude." The runway lights were filling the windshield. The ground was rising. "Now," Brian said. She pulled. Gently. The way you breathe out when you're trying not to wake someone up. The way you close a door when someone is sleeping on the other side of it. The nose rose some degrees. The main gear kissed the runway. Left first, then right. A double thump that she felt in the seat, and in her spine, and in her hands. And the aircraft was down. The nose wheel came forward and touched, and the thrust reversers deployed with a roar that filled the cockpit. And the aircraft began to slow. And the runway that had been rushing toward them at high speed was now passing beneath them and falling behind them. And they were slowing, slowing, still slowing. And then they were not moving. Emily Thompson released the yoke. She put both hands in her lap. She looked at the runway center line painted on the concrete ahead of her, and she breathed. One long, slow breath in through the oxygen mask, and then out. And she did not cry, and she did not scream, and she did not say anything for a very long time. Then Brian's voice came through the headset, and it was the only time in the entire flight that his voice broke, just slightly, at the edge of one word, and the word was her name. Emily. She pressed push to talk. I've got the aircraft stopped, she said. Both engines still running. Where do I go from here? In Denver Center, Rachel Patel pressed her push-to-talk button and found to her complete surprise that she could not immediately speak. She put her hand over her mouth for a moment, then she removed it, and her voice was steady. Alaska 391, she said. Welcome to Denver. Follow the emergency vehicles to the gate. And Emily, she paused just for a moment. That was one of the finest approaches I have ever worked in many years. Outside, the first fire truck was already rolling alongside the aircraft. Behind the cockpit door, 222 people were beginning to understand that they were alive. And in the right seat, an 11-year-old girl pressed both palms flat against her knees and let herself shake. Finally, fully, completely, for a moment. Then she stopped. There was still work to do. The engines were still running when the first paramedic climbed through the cockpit door. His name was Ethan Cooper, and he had been briefed several times on what to expect. 2 incapacitated pilots, possible carbon monoxide poisoning, an unaccompanied minor in the right seat. He had nodded at the briefing with the focused calm of a man who had seen difficult things before and believed he was prepared for this. He was not prepared for this. He stopped in the cockpit doorway and looked at the girl in the right seat. Small, dark-haired, the oversized oxygen mask still pressed to her face with one hand, the other hand resting in her lap, both engines still running at idle. The entire instrument panel glowing in front of her like something out of a dream, and for a moment he simply stood there, unable to move. Because the image in front of him did not match any category his brain had prepared for. Emily turned and looked at him over her shoulder. Engines are still running, she said. I didn't know the shutdown procedure. Ethan stepped forward. He said carefully, That's okay. We'll handle that. He reached past her for the radio. Can you tell me, are you hurt? Any dizziness, headache? Mild headache, she said. I've been on portable oxygen for some time. Okay. He moved to Captain Dawson first, checking pulse, checking airways, calling back through the door to his partner. Then to Bennett. He worked fast, efficiently, the way medics work when they have been trained to triage without hesitating. Both men were unconscious but stable, both breathing. He came back to Emily. I need you to come with me now. She did not move immediately. She looked at the instrument panel one more time. Altimeter showing Denver's elevation, engines at idle, all systems stable. And she did something that Ethan Cooper would describe later to every person who asked him about that day. She said thank you to the aircraft, not out loud. She just put her hand flat on the center console for a moment, the way you touch the shoulder of someone who helped you through something hard. Then she stood up. She was so small. That was the thing he kept coming back to. Standing in that cockpit, she barely reached the top of the seatbacks. She walked out of the cockpit door and into the forward cabin. And the moment she appeared, the entire aircraft went silent. 222 people looked at an 11-year-old girl walk out of the cockpit with an oxygen mask in her hand and a faded navy blue hoodie with embroidered wings on the sleeve, and nobody said a word for a full moment. Then the man who had been crying started to applaud. He did it the way people do when they have no other option, when their body needs to do something with what it is feeling and words are completely insufficient. His hands came together hard and loud and shaking. And then the woman with a little girl joined him. And then the businessman who had grabbed Karen's arm. And then Tyler Brooks from the back galley, who started clapping and then had to stop because he was crying too hard to do both at the same time. And then every single person on Alaska Airlines Flight 391, all 222 of them, was applauding, and some of them were standing, and some of them were holding each other. And some of them were doing all three things simultaneously and managing none of them well. And the sound filled the cabin of that aircraft, the way light fills a room when you open every curtain at once, suddenly, completely, and with an intensity that made it impossible to see anything clearly for a moment. Emily stood in the aisle and held the oxygen mask in both hands and looked at the faces looking at her. And her own face went through something complicated, something that started as composure and moved through surprise and arrived somewhere near the edge of tears, which she did not let fall, because she was still in the middle of something and she did not cry in the middle of things. Karen put her arm around Emily's shoulders. She didn't say anything. She just stood there with her arm around this child. And that was enough. The evacuation was orderly. That was the word the incident report would use later. Orderly, which meant nobody stampeded, nobody shoved, nobody lost their mind on the jet bridge. What it didn't capture was the texture of it, the way people touched each other as they filed off, hands briefly on strangers' arms, eye contact held a beat longer than usual, the shared acknowledgement of something that had happened to all of them and would not unhappen. Gerald Hutchins was brought off first on a stretcher, his color better, his pulse steady, his eyes open. He looked up at Tyler as they wheeled him past and said, "You're a good kid." Tyler said, "You're going to see your granddaughter graduate." Gerald smiled. "Yeah," he said, "I am." At the gate, Brian Thompson was standing with airport operations staff, having driven from the FAA Coordination Center in a borrowed vehicle at a speed that the officer who waved him through on the tarmac access road would later decide he had not technically observed. He had been standing at the gate door for some time when it opened. He had not moved. He had barely breathed. When Emily came through the door, he crossed the distance between them in steps and put his arms around her and held on. She led him, her face pressed against his jacket, and she made no sound, but her hands gripped the back of his shirt with a force that told him everything the silence was covering. He held her for a long time. Neither of them said anything. The airport's security personnel and operations staff who were standing in the jetway gave them the distance without being asked. Turning slightly away, finding things to look at that weren't the man and the girl who were holding each other in the middle of the worst and best moment of both their lives. Finally, Brian pulled back and held her face in both hands, the same way her grandmother had held it that morning in Seattle, and looked at her eyes. He was checking her. She understood that. She let him look. "Headache?" he asked. "Yes." "Vision?" "Fine. You're going to the hospital." "I know." "Emily." He stopped. Something was working in his face that he couldn't fully control. "Your mother." "Don't," she said softly. Not unkindly, just not yet. "Not yet, okay?" He nodded. He put his arm around her shoulders and walked with her toward the medical team that was waiting at the end of the jetway. What neither of them knew in that moment was that three things were already happening simultaneously that would change the next days of Emily's life in ways she could not have prepared for. The first thing was that someone on Flight 391, nobody ever determined who, had posted a single sentence to social media sometime after the aircraft stopped. The sentence was, "An 11-year-old girl just landed our plane at Denver, and we are all alive." It had been shared many times before Emily reached the end of the jetway. By the time she was sitting in a triage bay at Denver Health, it had been shared many times. By the time the blood draw came back showing her carbon monoxide levels were elevated but not critical, it was trending in many countries. The second thing was that the FAA had opened a formal investigation into Alaska Airlines maintenance records for Flight 391's aircraft, with specific focus on the carbon monoxide sensor deferral that Captain Frank Dawson had signed off on earlier. The investigator assigned to the case was a woman named Sandra Okafor, and she was very good at her job. And she had pulled Dawson's personnel file within an hour of landing and had found several prior maintenance discrepancy reports in the last few years, 2 of which had been resolved with paperwork irregularities that had never been formally addressed. She had called the Alaska Airlines maintenance director at home. She had not been polite about it. The third thing was that a reporter named Mark Reynolds, who covered aviation for a national outlet, and happened to be at Denver International that morning working on an entirely unrelated story about airport expansion, had overheard 2 paramedics talking in the corridor outside the triage bay. He had taken out his notebook. He had started making calls. Emily knew none of this yet. What Emily knew was that she was sitting on the edge of a hospital bed in a triage bay with a pulse oximeter on her finger and an IV in her left arm, and a doctor named Stephen Clark asking her questions in a voice that was so deliberately calm, it was almost comical. The kind of voice people use when they are very concerned and trying very hard not to show it. Any nausea? Some. Minor. Ringing in the ears? A little. Right ear, mostly. Has that happened before after flying? She thought about it. No. Dr. Clark made a note. He looked up at her. He was in his mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the kind of tired competence that emergency medicine cardiologists develop after years of seeing people at their worst. "You know," he said, "I've treated a few pilots in my career. Usually they come in here after accidents and they're—" He searched for the word. "Elsewhere. You know what I mean? Somewhere else in their head. You seem very present." "There's still a lot happening," Emily said. "Yeah," he said, "there is." He looked at her chart. "Your CO levels were elevated consistent with moderate exposure. Your uncle's levels were fine. He arrived later. Wasn't in the cockpit. The 2 pilots are in serious condition, but both are expected to recover." He set the chart down. The flight attendant, Karen, had some exposure too from the time she spent in the cockpit. "We're treating her as well." Emily absorbed this. "She put the mask on me," she said. "She gave me hers first." Dr. Clark nodded slowly. "That tracks," he said in the voice of a man who had just learned something about human nature that did not surprise him at all. He capped his pen. "Emily, can I ask you something off the record? Doctor, too." He stopped, reconsidered. "Just between us?" She looked at him steadily. "Sure." "Were you scared up there?" She was quiet for a moment. The pulse oximeter beeped. The IV drip did its slow work. "My hands shook once," she said. "I pressed them flat and they stopped. After that, I was just busy." She paused. "I think fear and busy can't really exist in the same space. There wasn't room for fear." Dr. Clark looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to remember that." Brian was in the hallway outside the triage bay on his phone doing several things at once, in the efficient and slightly alarming way of someone with a military background managing a crisis. He was talking to Emily's father, a man named Robert Thompson, who was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who had gotten the call some time ago and had been unable to do anything but sit at his kitchen table and hold the phone to his ear while the world rearranged itself around him. "She's okay, Robert," Brian was saying. "She's in triage. CO levels elevated, but not critical. She's alert. She's talking. She sounds like Emily." Robert Thompson said something that Brian couldn't quite catch because the man's voice had broken completely. "I know," Brian said. "I know." He pressed his hand to the wall and leaned his forehead against it briefly. "She landed it, Robert. She put that 757 on the runway like she'd done it 100 times. Some hours, a worn-out flight manual, and she put down a jet." His voice had something in it now that he couldn't keep entirely controlled. "I didn't teach her that. That was Jessica. That was your wife in that cockpit today." The silence on the line lasted a long time. Then Robert Thompson said very quietly, "I'm on the next flight." "I figured," Brian said. Sometime later, Paul Whitaker arrived at Denver Health having ridden with Carlos Mendoza from the FAA Coordination Center. He had asked to see Emily, and after some time of navigating hospital administration with the patient determination of a man who had once talked a jumbo jet out of a Venezuelan thunderstorm, he was shown to a family waiting room where Brian was sitting with a coffee cup he hadn't touched. The two men looked at each other across the room. Paul Whitaker was broad-shouldered, with white hair, and the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of rotating shifts and pressurized altitude. He had walked away from airlines some time ago, believing the most important flying of his life was behind him. He extended his hand. Brian shook it. "You taught her well," Paul said. Brian looked at the door to the triage bay. "I gave her the tools. She knew what to do with them." He glanced back at Paul. "You kept her calm. That was the whole thing. If she'd panicked." "She wasn't gonna panic," Paul said. "It was not a compliment. It was an observation. The kind a pilot makes about an aircraft characteristic. Factual, certain, based on evidence. I've been on the radio with scared pilots for many years. I knew in the first moments." They sat down. The coffee machine in the corner hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a PA system paged a doctor. Paul said, "What happens to her now?" Brian looked at the ceiling. "That's the question, isn't it?" He set his untouched coffee on the side table. "Technically, she violated federal aviation regulations, flew without a certificate on a commercial aircraft with passengers." He counted the violations on his fingers, not with distress, just with the precision of a man cataloging a situation. "She also saved 222 lives. So, Paul agreed. Sometime later, the door to the triage bay opened, and Emily came out in a hospital gown with an IV port taped to her left arm, walking with the slightly careful gait of someone who has been told to take it easy and is interpreting that guidance loosely. She saw Paul Whitaker and stopped. She had never seen him before. She had only heard his voice, but she knew who he was immediately. The voice matched the face in the way that voices sometimes match faces when someone has been exactly who they claim to be. "Captain Whitaker," she said. He stood up. He was almost twice her height. He looked down at her and she looked up at him. And then he did something that surprised Brian and surprised the nurse in the hallway and surprised Paul Whitaker himself because he had not planned it. He saluted her. Not the casual salute of ceremony, but the real one. Crisp, precise. The kind that Navy pilots give to each other when words don't cover what needs to be said. Emily looked at it for a moment. Then very solemnly she saluted back. Paul lowered his hand. His eyes were wet. He did not apologize for it. "It was an honor to fly with you," he said. Emily said, "You talked me through the whole thing. You listened to every word," he said. "That's the other half." She nodded. She seemed to want to say something more, but didn't have the words for it yet. Instead, she just looked at him with the particular directness she had. That look that made people feel she was reading something in them, more precisely than they were comfortable with. And then she said, "Do you think my mother would have done it differently?" Paul blinked. "I never knew your mother." "My uncle told you about her," she said. "In the car, probably. Or on the phone." Brian from across the room said nothing. Paul thought about the question seriously. He gave it the respect it deserved. "I think," he said carefully, "that your mother would have done it exactly the same. And I think she would have told you that landing doesn't prove you're a pilot. It's what you do in the approach that proves it." He paused. "You held your line through a crosswind on short final with a certain knot component in a 757, your first time in the type." Emily looked at him. "You were watching on radar, the whole way down." She nodded again. Something settled in her face. Not satisfaction exactly, but the particular peace of someone who has received information they needed and can now put it somewhere permanent. Sometime later, the story broke nationally. Mark Reynolds' piece went live, and within minutes it had been picked up by every major wire service. The headline was simple: 11-year-old girl lands commercial jet after both pilots collapse. The subheadline said, "Alaska Airlines Flight 391, Denver, 222 passengers aboard." By soon, the networks were interrupting regular programming. By later, Emily's name was in the chyron on cable news channels simultaneously. Brian saw it on his phone first. He walked back into the waiting room where Emily was sitting with Paul, the two of them deep in a conversation about crosswind correction technique that had been going for some time and showed no signs of stopping. And he held up the phone screen. Emily looked at it. She looked at the number of shares, and it was climbing while she watched. She looked at her own name in the headline. Slightly strange to see, the way your voice sounds strange in a recording. She looked at the photo. Someone had taken it on the jet bridge. Her coming through the door with the oxygen mask in her hand and Brian's arm around her shoulders. Her face turned slightly to the side. She looked small in the photo. She looked, she thought, like a kid. "It's going to get loud," Brian said quietly. "I know," she said. "We don't have to talk to anyone. Not today. Not until you're ready." She handed the phone back to him. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "Captain Dawson, what's happening with Captain Dawson?" The room went quiet. It was a question nobody had asked in her presence. And the fact that she was asking it now, before she had eaten, before she had slept, before she had processed any of the last hours, that said something about her that Paul Whitaker would talk about for the rest of his life. Brian sat down. He chose his words carefully. "The FAA has opened an investigation. He falsified maintenance records. He knew the sensor was faulty. He grounded the work order himself." Emily was quiet. "He nearly killed 222 people," Brian said. "He nearly killed you." "I know," she said. "Is he going to be okay, medically?" Brian looked at her. This child, he thought. This impossible, extraordinary child. "Doctors say yes." She nodded. "Good," she said. "He should have to answer for it." Paul Whitaker looked at his hands. "That's right," he said. "He should." Sometime later, the FAA administrator called Denver Center directly and spoke to Carlos Mendoza for some time. What was said in that conversation was not immediately public. What Carlos Mendoza told Rachel Patel afterward, standing in the break room with the door closed, was this: They're not charging her. They're figuring out how to handle the certification question, but nobody at the agency is interested in making an 11-year-old girl who just saved 222 lives the face of an enforcement action. That conversation is over. Rachel said, "What about a commendation?" Carlos said, "That conversation is just beginning." He was not wrong about that. Sometime later, while Emily was in a hospital room with an oxygen concentrator running, and Brian asleep in the chair beside her, her phone, which Brian had placed on the nightstand after charging it from the outlet near the window, lit up with a call from a Seattle number she didn't recognize. She answered. The voice on the other end said, "Is this Emily Thompson?" "Yes." "Emily, my name is Senator Elizabeth Harper. I represent Washington State. I've been briefed on what happened today, and I wanted to call personally to say." "Senator," Emily said, "I appreciate that. I do. But I'm really tired right now. Can someone call my uncle tomorrow?" A pause. Then the senator said, "Of course. Please rest." "Thank you," Emily said. She hung up. She looked at the ceiling. She could hear Brian's slow breathing from the chair. The oxygen concentrator hummed its steady rhythm. She thought about her mother. She thought about the way her mother had loved the sky, not because it was safe, but because it demanded everything. She thought about what it meant to fly into something that was bigger than you and come out the other side holding a line. She thought about the Boeing 757 sitting on a tarmac at Denver International right now, its engines cold, its cockpit empty, a runway somewhere behind it. She thought about the sound of the gear coming down, that deep rumble, those 3 green lights. She thought about the feel of the yoke in her hands when the autopilot disconnected and the aircraft became hers, completely and irrevocably, and about the specific quality of silence that had existed in that moment. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something else entirely. She thought, "I didn't save them because I was brave. I saved them because I knew what to do. And I knew what to do because I paid attention. Because I read the book several times, because I listened to my uncle, because my mother got into aircraft that frightened other people and flew them beautifully." She thought, that's what courage actually is. It's not the absence of fear. It's hours of flight time and a worn paperback in your backpack, and the decision, when the door is open and the cockpit is there, to walk through it. She turned off the lamp. In the dark, her phone lit up again. Not a call this time. A text from a number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it. She picked it up. The text said, "This is Alex Bennett, First Officer, Flight 391. I woke up some time ago. They told me what happened. I don't have the words yet, but I needed you to know that I know. A B." Emily looked at the message for a long time. Then she typed back, "I'm glad you're okay." She set the phone down. She closed her eyes. Outside, Denver was doing what cities do, moving, breathing, going about its business. The whole enormous, indifferent machine of it rolling forward into the afternoon. Inside a hospital room on a floor, an 11-year-old girl with elevated carbon monoxide levels and a mild headache, and hours in her logbook, pulled the blanket up to her chin and let herself, for the first time all day, fall completely apart. Quietly, alone, in the dark, the way that private people do their most important things. She cried for some minutes. Then she stopped and breathed and slept. And in the morning, everything would be different. But that was the morning. Right now, there was just the dark and the hum of the oxygen concentrator, and the slow breathing of her uncle in the chair, and the feeling, persistent, specific, impossible to explain to anyone who hadn't felt it, of having held something enormous in your hands and not let it fall. She woke up to the sound of her uncle's voice. He was in the hallway outside her hospital room, and he was not using his indoor voice. She could hear him through the door with the clarity of someone whose carbon monoxide headache had faded overnight into something manageable, leaving her senses sharp and her patience thin. "I understand that," Brian was saying, "but she is 11 years old, and she has not eaten a real meal since yesterday. And I am telling you that no camera crews are coming into this building before I have fed this child. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" A second voice, male, apologetic, the voice of someone who had been told no by people with considerably more authority than Brian Thompson and still hadn't learned how to absorb it gracefully, said something Emily couldn't quite catch. Brian said, "Then you can wait in the lobby." The hallway went quiet. Emily looked at the ceiling for a moment. The oxygen concentrator had been turned off sometime in the night. The IV port was still taped to her arm, but the line had been disconnected. Through the window she couldn't see, but could feel the particular quality of early morning light that pressed against curtains and said, "The world is already moving." It was already moving without her, and it had been moving all night, and the shape of it was completely different from the shape it had been some time ago. She sat up. The door opened, and Brian came in carrying a paper bag that smelled like eggs and a coffee cup that was clearly for him, and a bottle of orange juice that was clearly for her. And he set everything on the tray table and pulled up the chair and looked at her with the specific expression of a man who had slept little in a hospital chair and would not acknowledge this under any circumstances. "How's the head?" he asked. "Better," she said. "What was that in the hallway?" "Nothing you need to worry about yet." He pushed the paper bag toward her. "Eat first." She opened the bag. Breakfast sandwich, hash browns, the kind of food that exists at the intersection of practical and comforting. She ate in silence for some time, and Brian drank his coffee, and neither of them forced conversation, because they had always been good at silence together. It was one of the things that made him the right person to have taught her to fly. Good pilots understood that silence was not emptiness. It was preparation. Finally, she said, "How many people are out there?" "In the lobby?" He considered being vague, decided against it. Last count, several reporters, camera crews, producers from morning network shows, and a woman from the FAA who has been there since early, and who I like considerably better than the others because she brought her own coffee and isn't bothering anyone. He paused. "And your father lands soon." Emily set the sandwich down. "Dad's coming?" "He was on the red-eye." Brian looked at her. "He's been on the phone with me half the night. He needs to see you, Emily. Don't fight him on that." She picked the sandwich back up. "I'm not going to fight him." "Good." Sometime later, Dr. Stephen Clark came in for morning rounds with the slightly too cheerful energy of a physician who has decided that his patient had an extraordinary day yesterday and deserves to start this one better. He checked her oxygen levels excellent, reviewed the overnight blood work, asked her 3 questions about neurological symptoms, and declared with the satisfied finality of a man closing a completed file that she was cleared for discharge pending one final CO level check at some time. "You're going to feel tired for a few days," he said. "That's normal. The body processes carbon monoxide slowly. Drink a lot of water. Get sleep. Don't..." He stopped himself. He almost said, "Don't fly anything for a week," and then realized how that sounded and pivoted. "Don't push yourself," Emily said. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Captain Dawson and First Officer Bennett. What's their prognosis?" Dr. Clark's expression shifted, not to evasion, but to the careful neutrality of a physician discussing patients who were not his own. Bennett is expected to make a full recovery. He was discharged this morning. Dawson. A pause. Dawson sustained more prolonged exposure. There may be some lasting effects, cardiac involvement. We'll know more in the next few days. Emily absorbed this. Is he conscious? Since last night. Does he know what happened? What I mean is, does he know the full picture? He's been informed, yes. She nodded slowly. Okay, she said, in the voice of someone filing information into a place where it would sit, until she decided what to do with it. Dr. Clark left. Brian watched her face. You're thinking about going to see him, he said. No, she said. Then, maybe. Not today. Emily, I know what he did, she said quietly. I'm not excusing it. She stopped. Outside the door, the hospital corridor moved at its steady institutional pace. Nurses and orderlies and the wheel squeak of a cart going past. I spent some time keeping his aircraft in the air while he was unconscious in the seat in front of me. That's a strange thing to carry. I haven't figured out what to do with it yet. Brian looked at his niece for a long moment. You don't have to figure it out today. I know, she said. Today I'm going to see Dad. Some time later, Robert Thompson came through the door of the room with the specific energy of a man who had not slept, and had cried on an airplane and had rehearsed several different things to say, and had discarded all of them somewhere, because none of them were adequate. He was lean like Brian, but softer in the face, with reading glasses pushed into his hair and a jacket he had clearly thrown on over a shirt he had slept in. He stopped in the doorway and looked at his daughter, sitting up in the hospital bed with the IV port taped to her arm, and the orange juice half finished on the tray table, and her worn paperback copy of Stick and Rudder open in her lap. Someone had retrieved it from the aircraft. Karen had found it in the seatback pocket and brought it to the hospital herself. And something moved through his face that had no name in any language. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and put his arms around her, and she put her arms around him. And it was different from how Brian had held her on the jet bridge. Brian's embrace had been relief and military restraint and love all pressed together. Her father's was just complete. The way a child holds a parent, and a parent holds a child. The particular fit of it that doesn't change, no matter how old either of them gets. He didn't say anything for a while. She didn't either. Then he pulled back and held her face in his hands and looked at her the way her grandmother had looked at her that morning in Seattle, which felt like it had happened in a previous life. I need you to know something, he said. His voice was unsteady. He didn't apologize for it. I need you to know that I am... He stopped. Started again. I'm so proud of you that I can't hold it. I've been trying to hold it since Brian called and I cannot. You understand? Dad. His jaw worked. I know, Emily said softly. She would have... I know, Dad. He nodded. He pressed his forehead briefly against hers. Then he straightened up, took his glasses out of his hair, cleaned them on his jacket the way he always did when he needed something to do with his hands, and put them back. Okay, he said. Okay, tell me everything. She told him everything. She was halfway through the descent sequence when the FAA representative knocked on the open door. Her name was Sandra Okafor, the same Sandra Okafor who had pulled Captain Dawson's personnel file some time ago, who had found the maintenance discrepancy pattern, who had been in the lobby since early with her own coffee. She was precisely dressed, with the kind of posture that suggested she had never said an unnecessary word in her professional life and did not plan to start. I apologize for interrupting, she said. I can come back. Emily looked at her. Are you here about the investigation? Partly, Sandra said, and partly about something else. She came in. She sat in the chair Brian vacated. She looked at Emily with the direct, unornamented assessment of a federal aviation professional who had spent years evaluating pilots and aircraft and the intersection of human performance and mechanical systems. "What you did yesterday," Sandra said, "is going to be in FAA training materials within the year. I want you to know that. The radio transcript, the ATC recording, your performance on the approach, it is going to be studied by everyone who trains controllers and everyone who trains pilots for a long time." She paused. "That's not why I'm here." "Okay," Emily said. "I'm here because there's some regulatory questions that need to be addressed. Specifically, the question of your having operated a certificated commercial aircraft without appropriate certification. I want to be very clear about how the FAA views this situation." She opened the folder in her lap. "We view it as a life-saving emergency action by a minor with demonstrable training and exceptional competence under extreme conditions. The administrator has reviewed the transcript personally. There will be no enforcement action. That is final." Robert Thompson exhaled a breath he had been holding since Sandra Okafor entered the room. "Thank you," Emily said. "Don't thank me yet," Sandra said. "I'm also here to tell you that the FAA would like to explore an accelerated pathway for your formal certification. You have documented flight time, documented training, and a performance record that is," she chose her words, "unprecedented in my experience. There are mechanisms within federal aviation regulations for exceptional young aviators. We would like to begin that conversation with your family at whatever point you feel ready." The room was very quiet. Emily looked at her father. Her father looked at her. Brian, standing in the doorway, said nothing because there was nothing to add. And he knew it. Emily turned back to Sandra Okafor. "I want to do this properly," she said. "I want to earn the certificate, not because of yesterday." Sandra Okafor looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once with a respect that was not performative. "That's exactly what I expected you to say," she said. "And that's exactly what we'll do." She left her card on the tray table and showed herself out. The silence she left behind lasted a moment before Robert Thompson said very quietly, "Your mother would have said the same thing." Emily looked at the card. "I know, Dad." Sometime later, a hospital administrator came to inform them, with visible discomfort, that the situation in the lobby had escalated to the point where the hospital's director of communications felt it was affecting normal operations. And would the family perhaps be willing to consider a brief statement outside? Just a statement, not long. Brian looked at Emily. Emily looked at her father. Her father said, "It's your call." She thought about it for some time, genuinely, carefully thought about it, the way she thought about everything, which was to gather what information she had, assess what she was capable of, and make a decision she could stand behind. "Okay," she said, "but I have conditions." The administrator blinked. "Conditions?" "Karen Ellis needs to be there, and Captain Whitaker and—" She paused. "Is Rachel there? The controller?" "She drove up this morning," Brian said. "She's in the lobby." "Then Rachel, too." She looked at the administrator. "This wasn't just me. If I stand in front of cameras, they stand with me." The administrator looked at this 11-year-old girl in a hospital gown with an IV port in her arm and a paperback flying manual in her lap and said, "I'll make some calls." Sometime later, Emily Thompson stood on the steps of Denver Health Medical Center in her own clothes, the navy blue hoodie with the embroidered wings, a pair of jeans, sneakers, and on her left stood Karen Ellis, who was wearing a cardigan over her uniform blouse because her own jacket was still in the aircraft. On her right stood Captain Paul Whitaker in the blazer he had driven home to change into before coming back. Behind them stood Rachel Patel, who had driven from her home to be there and had brought her daughter, a young girl named Amara, who stood at her mother's side and stared at Emily with an expression of pure, uncomplicated wonder. The cameras were there. The reporters were there. The questions were already starting before Emily had finished arranging herself on the step. A wall of sound and light that was the most aggressively human thing she had ever stood in front of. She waited for it to settle. It didn't settle. She waited anyway. Then she spoke. "I want to say something before anyone asks me anything," she said. Her voice was not amplified. It didn't need to be. It had the quality it always had, carrying without effort, landing clearly without being raised. Yesterday, 4 people kept 222 people alive, not 1, 4. She gestured slightly to her left and right. Karen Ellis made the decision to let me into that cockpit when she had no reason to trust me, except that she was paying attention. Captain Whitaker talked me through every single instrument in that aircraft, from a room in Denver while I was at high altitude. Rachel Patel cleared the airspace, ran the approach, and said things to me on that radio that made me believe I could do it. If any of those 3 people had been different, had been a little less focused, a little less calm, a little less good at their job, the outcome would have been different. Please understand that. The cameras ran. Nobody interrupted. I also want to say, and I've thought about how to say this, that what happened yesterday didn't have to happen. There was a faulty sensor on that aircraft that was known to the flight crew. That sensor would have detected the carbon monoxide if it had been working. None of this happens. 2 pilots don't collapse. I stay in my seat and read my book and land in Boston. That part of the story isn't about bravery. It's about accountability. And I think it deserves at least as much attention as I'm getting right now. In the back of the gathered crowd, a reporter named Mark Reynolds wrote something in his notebook and underlined it twice. A different reporter, a woman with a network badge, said, "Emily, were you scared?" Emily looked at her. "My hands shook once," she said. "I pressed them flat and they stopped. After that, I just did the next thing." She paused. "That's all flying is. You do the next thing. You don't fly the whole flight at once. You fly the next moments and then the moments after that. Where did you learn that?" She looked at Brian, who was standing to the side with her father. "From my uncle." She looked somewhere past the cameras, somewhere that was hers and nobody else's. "And from my mother." A silence moved through the crowd. Not the silence of people waiting for more, but the silence of people receiving something. Then another reporter. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Emily looked at him with an expression that was not quite impatience, more like the look of someone who has just been asked a question they have already settled. "A pilot," she said. "I want to be a pilot." She thought for a moment. "And I want to be the kind of pilot who files every maintenance report." Every one. The laughter that went through the crowd was the releasing kind. The kind that comes when tension finds a small exit point and pours through it. At the back of the crowd, standing slightly apart, was a woman Emily did not recognize. Mid-50s, dark coat, standing very still in the way of someone who has come to observe rather than participate. She was looking at Emily with an expression that was difficult to read. Not hostility, not admiration exactly. Something more complicated than either. Her name was Helen Dawson, She was Frank Dawson's wife. She had driven to the hospital that morning, not knowing what she intended to do when she got there, driven by something she couldn't name, guilt that wasn't hers. Apologies she didn't know how to make, the particular anguish of a person whose love for someone has been complicated by what that person turned out to be capable of. She had not gone inside. She had stood across the street for some time and then moved to the back of the crowd when the statement began, and she had listened to every word. When the statement ended and the cameras began to disperse, she turned to leave. Emily's voice stopped her. "Ma'am." Helen turned. She did not know how the girl had seen her. She was at the back of a crowd of people, and she had not said a word. But Emily was looking directly at her. The two of them looked at each other across the crowd, which had thinned enough that there was a clear line between them. Helen Dawson's face was doing everything that she had been trying to prevent it from doing for the last hours. She did not cry, but the effort of not crying was visible from some distance away. Emily walked toward her. Brian took a step forward, instinctive, protective, and Emily put her hand up briefly, the same way Brian had held up his hand to Carlos Mendoza in the FAA Center. "Just wait. I've got this." She stopped in front of Helen Dawson. Helen said, and couldn't finish. "I know who you are," Emily said quietly. "You don't have to say anything." "I'm so sorry," Helen said. It came out broken, the words not quite holding their shape. Emily looked at her for a long moment. "What your husband did was wrong," she said. "The investigation is going to show that, and he's going to have to answer for it. That's how it should work." She paused. "But you didn't do it, and you're standing here, which means you know the difference between those two things." She met the woman's eyes. "That's not nothing." Helen Dawson pressed her hand to her mouth. She nodded once and then turned and walked away quickly. And Emily watched her go and said nothing more because there was nothing more to say. Brian appeared at her shoulder. "You okay?" "Yes," she said. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. The crowd had thinned to a handful of stragglers and a few remaining cameras that had caught the exchange without audio. Mark Reynolds had caught it with audio, because Mark Reynolds was good at his job and had been standing at the precise right distance. He would debate for some days whether to include it in his follow-up piece. He ultimately did. He described it as the only moment in days of covering the story when he had to put his notebook down. The twist that landed hardest, harder than the landing itself, harder than the cockpit door opening, harder than the moment Emily's name went trending in many countries, came sometime later when the NTSB released a preliminary finding that had been sitting in the FAA's inbox since that morning. The carbon monoxide sensor on Flight 391's aircraft had not been the only faulty unit in Alaska Airlines Fleet. There were several others on several other active aircraft, all of them flagged in maintenance reports, two of them carrying passengers right now in the air at that moment, on routes that had nothing to do with Seattle or Boston or Denver. Sandra Okafor was on the phone before the release finished loading on her screen. The FAA administrator was on a call with Alaska Airlines CEO within minutes. Both aircraft were diverted. Both landed without incident. The sensors were replaced on the ground in under an hour. But the fact of it that it had not been one plane, one man, one criminal act of negligence, that it had been a pattern, a systemic failure, a culture within that airline's maintenance division that had prioritized schedule over safety for long enough to produce not one Frank Dawson, but potentially more, that landed in the news cycle like a second impact. And the story that had been about a girl became also a story about a system that had failed, and about what it costs when the people responsible for keeping machines safe decide that the machines are someone else's problem. Emily heard about it from her father, who saw it on his phone and handed it to her without comment. She read it twice. She set the phone on the tray table. She looked at the ceiling. She said, very quietly to nobody in particular, "Several more." Robert Thompson said, "They caught it because of yesterday." "Because of Karen," Emily said, "because she opened the cockpit door and saw it. If she hadn't, the NTSB might not have looked as hard." She was quiet for a moment. "People need to know that part too." She picked up the phone and sent a text to Mark Reynolds, whose number Sandra Okafor had passed along that morning, with a note that said simply, "He's trustworthy." The text said, "The other aircraft, that's the real story. Can we talk?" Mark Reynolds replied quickly, "Yes." Sometime later, Robert Thompson sat with his daughter in the hospital room, while the oxygen concentrator hummed and the last of the afternoon light came through the curtain gap, and the hallway outside had finally, mercifully, gone quiet. Brian had gone to get food. They were alone for the first time since he had arrived. He said, "What do you want to do when this is all over? When the cameras go away and the FAA paperwork is done, what do you actually want?" Emily thought about it. She looked at the worn paperback on the tray table. Stick and rudder, dog-eared and highlighted and read several times. A book that smelled like a used bookstore in Annapolis, and like the cockpit of a Cessna, and like her uncle's house on Saturday mornings. "I want to fly," she said, "properly with a certificate and a logbook and a flight examiner and the whole thing. I want to earn it." She paused. "And I want to fly the 757 again someday." "You will," her father said. It was not wishful thinking. It was a statement of fact about someone he knew. "I know," she said, "but I want to earn that too." She picked up the book, ran her thumb along the spine. "Mom always said the sky doesn't give you anything. It only shows you what you already have." She looked at her father. "I think I understand that now." Robert Thompson looked at his daughter, this child who had his wife's hands and her uncle's precision, and something else entirely that belonged only to herself. And he did not cry, though he wanted to. He said, "She would have loved to see you fly today." Emily looked at the curtain. Behind it, Denver was moving into evening, the light going amber and long, the kind of light that pilots love because it makes the ground look temporary. She thought about high altitude and the altimeter unwinding, and the sound of the gear coming down, and the moment when the autopilot disconnected and the aircraft was completely hers. She thought about holding it like a bird. She thought, "I flew it, Mom. I flew it all the way down." "She was there," Emily said. "I know she was." Sometime later, Emily Thompson sat in the left seat of a Cessna 172 at a flight school outside of Denver. Sometime after her 12th birthday with a CFY named Reyes. No relation to anyone. Just a coincidence that made her smile, in the right seat and a logbook open on her knee. And hours becoming more. She flew a perfect pattern. She made a perfect landing. She taxied back to the ramp and shut down the engine and sat in the quiet cockpit for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The CFI said, "That's your best one yet." "I know," she said. She opened the logbook. She wrote the date, the aircraft type, the duration, the conditions. She wrote in the remarks column what she wrote after every flight. The thing her uncle had taught her to write, the thing her mother had always believed. She wrote, "Paid attention." She closed the logbook. She had a long way to go. She had a certificate to earn, and ratings to build, and thousands of hours ahead of her, and a Boeing 757 waiting somewhere in the future that she intended to fly properly, with authorization, With every checklist complete and every sensor working and every maintenance report filed without exception, she had a long way to go, and she knew exactly how to get there. The same way she had gotten through the approach on the runway at Denver International, one decision at a time, one interval at a time. Eyes on the instruments and hands steady, and the voice of everyone who had ever believed in her ear, and her mother's sky above her, vast and indifferent, and absolutely magnificent. She had already proven what she was made of at high altitude in a cockpit that wasn't hers, with 222 lives in her hands. Everything from here was just flying. In the end, this wasn't just a story about an 11-year-old girl who landed a jet. It was a story about what real courage actually looks like. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the quiet decision to do the next right thing, even when your hands are shaking, and the whole world feels like it's hanging by a thread. Emily didn't save 222 lives because she was fearless or superhuman. She saved them because she had paid attention for years to her mother's love of the sky, to her uncle's patient lessons, to every page of that worn-out flying manual she read again and again. When the moment came, she simply walked forward, sat down, and chose to be useful instead of afraid. That's the lesson that stays with me long after the applause fades. Greatness isn't loud or dramatic. It's built in the small, steady moments when no one is watching. Reading the book one more time, listening carefully, showing up prepared. Real heroes aren't born in perfect conditions. They're forged in the ordinary days that prepare them for the unimaginable ones. So the next time life throws something bigger than you at you, remember Emily in that cockpit. Breathe, stay calm, do the next thing, and trust that everything you've quietly learned will be there when you need it most. If this story touched something deep inside you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss moments like this. Drop your city in the comments and tell me, what's one small thing you're doing today that might one day become the thing that saves everything? I read every single comment, and I can't wait to hear from you. See you in the next one.